Great to be joined again here on Flow FM by Jason Hall, the State Secretary of the Finance Sector Union. Jason, welcome back.
Morning, Ricky, and morning to your listeners.
Jason, last time we talked, we were talking about the closure of a bank branch at Kapunda. There have been others in regional South Australia, but it's irritating people all over regional Australia, and now there's going to be another inquiry in Canberra.
Yes, and hopefully this one, as opposed to the regional bank task force that the Liberals set up, will have a bit more teeth and we'll look at the actual true impacts to those local communities.
Now, when you say, well, you hope it'll have a bit more teeth, what were your concerns about this regional banking task force that the Coalition thought was pretty good, and they reckon the recommendations they made were pretty good as well?
Well, as soon as it was set up, we knew we were in trouble, Ricky, when all of the people that were on that task force were the banks, the post office and local government, all people that kind of have a vested interest in the way banking works. Well, this is now a Senate inquiry, and the Senate inquiry in its statement of terms and conditions will look at things like community impact, which is really important because we know banks can sometimes be the lifeblood of these small community towns.
One of the people that is in our broadcast areas outside of South Australia, Anne Webster, member for Mallee, she's called for the banks to have a moratorium on any further bank closures until the recommendations of that report are implemented. But can you see the banks actually just suddenly imposing a moratorium because she's asked for it?
They did, for example, during the height of COVID, there was a moratorium on branch closures, so the banks can do it. These are organisations that make billions of dollars of profit, so putting back some of their decisions by 12 months, I'm sure, is not going to hurt them until we find out exactly the best way to deal with branch closures.
When it comes to the banks, look, we may have discussed this last time on bank closures, but I remember during the global financial crisis, there was a fair bit of federal assistance or guaranteeing of bank balances by the government and taxpayers to make sure the banks stayed afloat. Is it sort of fair for them to start closing or just be closing so many regional branches when they have received so much support from taxpayers?
I think you're exactly on the money. I think this isn't just about a commercial decision. This is about providing services to communities that need those services. And we don't want to see issues like, for example, Kapunda not having a bank, which means people have to drive, down to Gawler or Clare or Newry or whatever, and doing like an hour round trip just to do their banking services. It puts, especially for those people that don't have a license or are elderly, it makes it very difficult. So, we want to make sure that these communities are looked after.
I start to get the impression that there's a view, whether it's in Canberra or with the banks, that, okay, we can abandon a particular regional community because Australia Post might step into the gap. But what's the deficit between what Australia Post might be able to do as a quasi-banking service versus a proper bank branch?
I think there's a couple of issues there. Definitely there's different services. For example, you can't go in there and talk about your personal loan or your credit card balance or how to deal with different financial solutions. It's purely a transactional type environment. Plus, post offices aren't set up to do the security and stuff issues that banks are. And lastly, we know that post offices are also closing across the country. So, we see banks using post offices as a solution, but then what happens if your post office closes as well? These people then are left completely without any services whatsoever.
And not only the people who in that community lose those services, first of all, we don't tend to see banks suddenly reopen a branch off the back of a closure. It's usually a one-way street on this, isn't it?
100% it's a one-way street. We've seen over the last few years, 650 branches close across the country. A fair chunk of those are in regional Australia, and there's very few that have been opened in response.
And I guess lastly, when it comes to the staff, you're the union, you represent staff that work in banks. They're members of the community. How hard is it for them to, either relocate if they're familiar with banking work or find other work in the local community?
Well, as you know, the job market is difficult in regional locations. So we have these trained, skilled workers that find it very hard to find alternative work once a branch closes. And it also takes away an opportunity or a career path or employment opportunities for these communities when the branches are closing and taking that resource away from the community itself. So it is a huge burden on our members.
And lastly, this motion that sets up this new inquiry was moved by, I would call him a renegade Queensland LNP Senator in Gerard Rennick. Never mind how the inquiry came about, but you're hoping this one will come out with some more useful recommendations that might actually halt bank closures?
100% hope so. Look, the terms of reference for this inquiry, already is better than looking at the task force that the Liberals put in 2021. And let's hope that they take into account things like the impact on employees, like our members, as well as the true impact to those communities, as opposed to something which was, as I said before, basically run by the banks.
Well, we'll check in a bit more with the Banking Association and others on this one, and hopefully we do see some halting of bank closures. Jason Hall, South Australian State Secretary for the Finance Sector Union, thanks for joining us today on Flow.
Thanks, Ricky, and hope your listeners have a good day.